What does a person have to do for a state to decide to kill them? Many people immediately think of murder or terrorism, but there are cases in which people were sentenced to death for things that are impossible to comprehend. Take, for example, the case of a grandmother who was arrested by police while on vacation and suddenly faced execution for drug trafficking, even though she had nothing to do with it. How that could happen, and what other shocking stories exist of people who received the death penalty for unbelievable reasons is what we are about to tell you now. Let's begin with the already mentioned story of the grandmother. The then 56-year-old Lindsay Sandiford from the United Kingdom had just landed at Ngurah Rai Airport in Bali when her suitcase was inspected and the police found something inside that would later cost her her life. 3.8 kilograms of cocaine were hidden in a false bottom of her suitcase. Naturally, you might ask yourself why she would be so stupid as to take such a risk, especially in a country like Indonesia, which has some of the strictest drug laws in the world. However, Lindsay was not actually at fault herself. She later testified that she had absolutely nothing to do with drugs, but that she was being blackmailed by a drug gang. They threatened to harm her children and grandchildren if she did not transport the drugs. In order to convince the police of her innocence, she even helped officers lure the members of the gang into a trap. None of this, however, mattered to the court. In 2013, Lindsay was nevertheless sentenced to death. How ruthless some courts can be is also shown by the next case from Corsicana, Texas. In December 1991, shortly before Christmas, the 23-year-old Cameron Todd Willingham was accused of what is perhaps the worst crime a family man can commit. He was accused of murdering his own children, allegedly by setting fire to his own home. The children's mother was not at home at the time when a fire broke out in the family's house and spread extremely quickly. Cameron claimed that he had been asleep and was no longer able to save his three daughters, Carmen, Cameron, and Amber. All three died in the flames.
My little girl was crying, "Daddy, Daddy." When I woke up, the whole house was in smoke.
The court later classified these recordings of the father as acting because the police claimed to have found evidence that Cameron had started the fire himself and wanted to kill his children. One of these alleged pieces of evidence was the fact that Cameron himself was completely unharmed, which was said to indicate that he had not searched for his children inside the burning house. In addition, certain burn patterns were found on the floor that supposedly suggested the use of an accelerant. Residues of an accelerant were also found on the porch, but what no one paid attention to was that these most likely came from the barbecue grill that had previously stood there. The court, however, opted for the simplest explanation, and that was arson. Cameron maintained his innocence until the very end, but he was still sentenced to death and executed in 2004. Independent experts later reviewed the case and came to the conclusion that there was not a single real piece of evidence for arson and that it was probably an accident caused by an electrical short circuit. But by then, it was already too late for Cameron Willingham. Now let's move on to a very curious case from China, in which a farmer put the lives of thousands of children at risk and paid for it with his own life. Zhang Yujun was a dairy farmer from Hebei province who produced milk powder for babies and sold it on to other companies. In September 2007, he decided to maximize his profits and came up with a particularly devious plan. He began adulterating his milk with the chemical substance melamine. Adding this substance made the protein content appear especially high in quality inspections, even though the milk was diluted. The problem was that melamine is toxic and can cause severe kidney stones and kidney failure. That did not seem to concern Zhang Yujun at all. By the time the scandal was uncovered a year later, he had already produced 770 tons of this mixture. At that point, 6 children had already died from the contaminated milk and 300,000 people had been poisoned. When public safety is endangered on such a massive scale, China shows no mercy. The legal system is very strict, and so it was quickly decided that Zhang Yujun would receive the death penalty. On November 24, 2009, he was indeed executed. What is almost even more unbelievable, however, is that in China, the same punishment can also be imposed on people who have never physically harmed anyone. The Chinese national Bai Tianhui had to experience that Chinese courts show no mercy even in cases of economic crimes. As a former CEO and manager of a state-owned financial corporation, he accepted enormous bribes between 2014 and 2018. Around 134 million euros accumulated, which he transferred to his private accounts and used entirely for himself. In Europe, such an offense would usually result in a prison sentence of 10 to 15 years. China, on the other hand, argues that Bai Tianhui caused such great damage to the state and the population that it must be punished with death. He therefore actually received the death penalty and was executed that same year in Tianjin, China. Even if it is highly questionable whether this harsh punishment was justified, at least in Bai Tianhui's case, one could be sure that he was guilty. In another case, however, the guilt of the accused was anything but certain. This refers to the 21-year-old Carlos de Luna from Corpus Christi, Texas. He practically ran straight into the arms of the police when they were looking for a suspect in the murder of 24-year-old mother Wanda Lopez, who was robbed and then stabbed while working at a gas station. The police arrived at the scene very quickly, began searching for the perpetrator, and found Carlos de Luna a few streets away, hiding under a truck. When an eyewitness also claimed to recognize him, the matter was clear for the police. De Luna had to be the murderer. However, he swore that he had nothing to do with the robbery. All of his statements in court were in vain. He was nevertheless found guilty and sentenced to death, and in 1989 he was executed by lethal injection. As it later turned out, this was a huge mistake. De Luna was most likely confused with the real perpetrator, Carlos Hernandez. The two actually looked very similar, so it is quite possible that the witness mistakenly identified De Luna as the offender. In addition, it was striking that no DNA traces of De Luna could be found at the crime scene, and not a single drop of the victim's blood was found on his shirt. Hernandez, on the other hand, was already known for similar crimes. This was therefore a massive miscarriage of justice, and De Luna seemed to have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sadly, the same is true for the then 19-year-old student Rehana Jabari from Iran. In 2007, she was approached by an older man who asked whether she would like to work for him as an interior designer. The two then met in his apartment for what was supposed to be a business meeting. Rehana quickly realized, however, that this was not about a potential job, but about something entirely different. As he moved closer and closer to her, she was faced with the hardest decision of her life. She had to weigh whether she would allow herself to be abused and possibly killed afterward, or whether she would become the perpetrator herself. She decided to save her own life and stabbed him in the back with a knife. The man later died in the hospital, and Rehana was convicted of murder. The fact that she acted in self-defense was not taken into account. The court agreed that she should now pay with her own life and sentenced her to death. After 7 years in prison, she was executed in 2014. Now let's turn to another case in which injustice prevailed. In 1944, 2 white girls were found dead in a small town in South Carolina, but there was no trace of a murderer. Coincidentally, a black 14-year-old boy named George Stinney happened to be nearby. The police therefore took him into custody and simply named him as the murderer, even though he had no weapon or any other evidence on him. He was not even provided with a lawyer. The police then claimed that George had confessed to the crime during interrogation. However, there were never any audio recordings of this. Today, it can be said with considerable certainty that all of this was a lie, and that the goal was simply to present a perpetrator to the public as quickly as possible. To achieve this, they quite literally went over dead bodies, because George was even sentenced to death. As a result, he became the youngest person to be executed in the United States in the 20th century. He was even too small for the straps of the electric chair and had to be placed on books during his execution. Far too young to be executed was also the 16-year-old Atefa Rajabi Sahaleh from the city of Naqqa in Iran. Even worse than her age was the reason why she had to die. She was convicted of immoral behavior and corruption because she allegedly had extramarital relationships and maintained contact with too many men. In truth, however, she was forced into these intimacies, and the court tried to portray the abuse as seduction on her part. When Atefa also rebelled during the trial and removed her headscarf, she effectively exposed herself in the eyes of the judge, and according to the court, she now more than deserved the death penalty. On August 15, 2004, she was publicly hanged from a crane. Isn't it unbelievable what kinds of reasons some people have been executed for in other countries?